Police say their investigation first started at this home on Pine Grove Road months ago. Investigators say after Williams and King hadn't paid rent for a while, detectives started looking into their financial transactions, and it led them to their extensive scheme.
The prosecutor overheard Shirley telling him, "You could go to Steve's place in Dubai, where his son Winton lives, in lay low."
And I'm almost sure that she just didn't invite her husband to go over there without Steve's permission.
I know.
It began like any other quiet neighborhood case, a missed rent payment, a few unanswered calls. But behind those walls on Pinarove Road, investigators stumbled onto something far bigger than overdue bills. What started as a landlord complaint suddenly cracked open a trail of transactions that didn't make sense, money moving where it shouldn't, names showing up that didn't belong there, and somewhere in the middle of it all, a familiar one, Shirley Strawberry. Then came the whisper that changed everything. A prosecutor allegedly overheard Shirley telling someone, "You could go to Steve's place in Dubai, lay low there." That single line turned a local investigation into a headline, because when you mention Steve Harvey and lay low in the same sentence, the internet doesn't wait for confirmation, it explodes. That's when people started asking the real question, what did Steve know? And more importantly, why would Shirley even mention his name in a conversation tied to an active investigation? The deeper you look, the more it feels like this wasn't some random slip. There's a pattern forming, quiet favors, hidden connections, and a story that's about to test one of the most carefully managed reputations in Hollywood. But this is just where it starts. Because once Steve's name entered the room, nothing about this case stayed small anymore.
Let me ask you a question. The woman that you about to ask me this question about, do you love her? Okay then, Shirley.
Yes.
This your man right here. What?
It's a mess, though.
Wait a minute.
By this point, the story wasn't just about unpaid rent or strange money transfers. It had become a web that touched names nobody ever thought would be connected. People close to the situation started whispering, Shirley wouldn't send her husband to Steve's place without permission. That one thought alone changed the tone of the entire case. Because if that's true, it means Steve wasn't just a bystander in this chaos. He was aware, maybe even involved. Then the dominoes started falling. First came the rumors, then the screenshots, and before long, Shirley Strawberry, a woman long respected for her professionalism on air, was now the centerpiece of an online storm. Her name was being dragged through digital mud, and Steve Harvey's was right there beside it. What made it worse was the timing. Steve had already been battling whispers about his personal life, and now this. The story caught fire again, burning hotter than before. Each new post, each quote, each sound bite only poured gasoline on the flames. This wasn't just bad press, this was reputational collapse in real time. And for a man like Steve Harvey, whose brand thrives on control, laughter, and moral advice, being tied to a scandal that smelled like a cover-up was nothing short of disastrous. But if you think this was where things peaked, you're wrong, because the next revelation was the one that made people truly stop and ask, was this ever just about Shirley's husband? Was this ever just about Shirley's husband? What follows feels less like coincidence and more like the slow unfolding of a script someone wrote for maximum damage. The question investigators keep circling back to is simple. How many doors did this man walk through while everyone believed he was harmless? Not who he was married to, not where he slept, who he talked to, whose names he dropped, which accounts he touched. They begin where most investigations begin, with records, phone logs, bank statements, the raw, unglamorous stuff that doesn't make headlines until you connect the dots. When you follow those lines, patterns emerge, repeated transfers, shell companies with the kind of names that sound official but dissolve when you press them. Payments routed through third parties, small amounts at first, then bigger, timed to coincide with appearances and public events. If this is a scheme, it's the kind that depends on trust. A friendly face, a plausible link, a name people recognize. That's the dangerous part. It's not the crime itself, it's the mechanism. People buy the story because the cover sounds real. Someone vouches, someone smiles on camera. A connection becomes the currency that buys credibility. Now imagine those transactions threading through the edges of a major media operation, not necessarily into the main payroll, not necessarily labeled Steve Harvey Fund, just lines that ripple near the periphery, vendors, PR firms, boutique consultancies, businesses that sound like they belong in a production meeting. That's the map investigators quietly start drawing. Every line is a question, every question leads to another name, and every name brings the potential of reputational fallout. There's another layer here that rarely gets talked about in the hours after a scandal breaks: the human calculus behind silence. Why do some people rush to the mic and others close ranks? For visible personalities, the choice is rarely about guilt, it's about consequence. One statement can trigger subpoenas. One offhand defense can be replayed in courtrooms and in press conferences for years. So silence often looks like avoidance, but it's also strategy. Still, strategy has limits when legal filings start appearing. When prosecutors file paperwork, when judges sign warrants, the game changes. The narrative moves from gossip to paperwork. That shift is what terrifies brands and advertisers. Contracts have clauses that kick in when a principal is implicated in wrongdoing. Talent deals have morality language. Networks have clauses tied to liability. It's not hyperbole to say a single charge can rearrange decades of deals, which brings us to the public's real worry. What if there are traces that tie back to a broader circle? Not because someone wants to smear a legacy, but because where money flows, responsibility follows. That's the legal logic. If money passed through channels that someone controlled or approved, the question becomes not whether they knew, but whether they should have known. In the world of high-profile media, the difference between willful blindness and plausible ignorance often comes down to documents, calendars, approvals, signed invoices. And in those documents, nuance matters. A text saying, "help out," is not the same as a notarized wire transfer. A friendly call about a vacation plan is not the same as arranging transportation to another country. But to the public, nuance is rarely felt, it's seen. A single sentence leaked into a headline can collapse subtle distinctions into simple moral categories: protector, enabler, or co-conspirator. That's why the rumor about laying low in Dubai stung so badly. Not because the words prove anything, but because they compress 1,000 possible interpretations into one image: escape. Escape is the story everyone understands. It's cinematic. It fits a script people already know, the wrongdoer slipping away as the rest of the world scrambles. Whether that image holds up under scrutiny is another matter, but in the hours between rumor and report, images win. At the same time, consider the pressure on the people closest to the center. Shirley's public statements, the apologies, the moments of visible despair, they are not just PR moves. They are survival mechanisms. When your personal life becomes the axis of a legal storm, the instinct is to contain, clarify, fix the smallest fires before the house burns. That's what public figures try to do, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But the attempt itself is instructive. It tells you whose first reflex is to shield the institution versus shield the family. What complicates this further is the reality of how influence operates. Reputation is an ecosystem. It's curated by teams, publicists, legal counsel, managers, and producers. When a name in that ecosystem becomes tainted, the network reacts fast. There are emergency meetings, scripts are rewritten, advertisers call, internal memos circulate. People start thinking in scenarios. If X becomes public, what falls next? If Y is subpoenaed, which contracts are at risk? The calculus is surgical. It's about containment. It's about triage. But containment depends on trust, on whether the team believes the problem is isolated or systemic. That's why the deeper worry is never just one man's crimes. The deeper worry is whether this is a symptom of a larger oversight problem. Were due diligence checks cursory? Were red flags waved away because of a perceived personal loyalty? That's the real vulnerability for any organization built on relationships as much as contracts. And while executives are drafting contingency plans, the cultural conversation accelerates in a different direction. People begin to ask broader questions about celebrity and accountability. How do we assign blame when private fraud happens next to public goodwill? How much responsibility do workplaces hold for the private lives of the people who orbit them? Those questions are uncomfortable because they force us to reconcile admiration with accountability, and they never have neat answers. Back in the courtroom of public opinion, the receipts that matter are rarely the legal filings at first. They are the small, human details that make the story sticky. Someone remembering a name used in a pitch, an old voicemail leaked to a blog, an invoice that mentions a familiar production company but routes payment through an unfamiliar lawyer. Those micro-evidence pieces don't convict anyone alone, but they form the scaffolding that makes larger patterns plausible. Now imagine an investigator quietly compiling a timeline. Each meeting, each transfer, each introduction, they look for the rhythms that indicate intent. Did Ernesto's activity spike right after a high-visibility event? Was there a sudden increase in third-party payments when a new venture started? Those rhythms, more than any single headline, tell you whether you're looking at opportunism or an orchestrated operation. And then there's motive. The classic trap of human narrative is to assume motive equals excuse. It doesn't. People behave badly for reasons: greed, fear, delusion, or the seduction of access. But motive helps investigators build a story. If someone promised access to a big network or to career opportunities, that promise itself can be the lure. That's how con artists operate. They sell more than a product. They sell a future. And when that future is tied to real people, hosts, producers, personalities, it's believable. Across the public sphere, reactions fall into patterns. Some cast Shirley as a tragic figure, the partner who trusted and was betrayed. Others treat her as a cautionary tale about the risks of proximity to power. Both reactions miss the point that personal betrayal often has public consequences. The interplay between intimacy and professional association is messy. It's where private errors become public crises. At the center of that mess sits the idea of repair. What does repair look like when reputations are fractured? There's legal repair, court cases, settlements, and subpoenas. There's reputational repair, statements, charity work, regained visibility. And there's personal repair, which is often the hardest, a life recalibrated after trust collapses. Public figures can buy legal cover and PR resets, but personal trust is not something you can file under a claim. We should also consider what this moment means for institutions that depend on trust. Daytime television, radio shows, and family brands operate on the premise of reliability. Audiences tune in because they feel a relationship has been cultivated, a sense of warmth, advice, and familiarity. When that feeling is punctured, viewers don't just react to the scandal. They reevaluate the emotional contract they had with that media property. That's where a scandal becomes existential. It's not just about contracts lost, it's about the erosion of trust the audience once placed in a persona. Which leads to another uncomfortable but necessary question. Is there a threshold where a person's silence becomes more damaging than their words? Public statements can be risky, yes, but silence invites narrative. Absence is fertile ground for speculation. When a figure like Steve, someone whose career is built on being outspoken, chooses quiet, it reshapes the story. Audiences begin to fill the vacuum with assumptions. Lawyers may advise caution, but the court of public opinion rarely understands legal nuance. Still, the next moves matter. There are several possible trajectories from here, and none are neat. The case could narrow. Evidence could show that Ernesto's actions were entirely independent, relying on his own web of contacts. That would be a lifeline for those nearby, if it comes with conclusive documentation and transparent legal outcomes. Alternatively, the case could expand, pulling in more names and more records, forcing a cascade of disclosures and depositions that drag more people into the glare. There's also the middle path, a messy place where partial responsibility is dispersed. Maybe some associates were lax, maybe processes failed, maybe loyalties blurred due to personal ties. In those scenarios, accountability looks less like criminal indictments and more like resignations, internal reviews, and long-term reputational damage. That path is less cinematic, but perhaps more realistic. The slow, structural aftermath that changes how organizations vet, monitor, and respond to personal relationships. Through all of this, it's important to remember the real victims who never make the headlines, people who were allegedly scammed, those small business owners and everyday folks who trusted a promise and lost money. Their stories are the moral backbone of any scandal. When the conversation focuses only on celebrities and brand damage, those victims get sidelined. A credible recounting of events must bring them back into focus. Without that, The narrative risks becoming self-serving, centered on elite discomfort rather than real harm. And then there's the performative layer. In our era, crisis management is almost an art form. We watch how statements are crafted. We note the language of contrition. We analyze the choreography of apologies. But beyond the performance, there's accountability. Institutions must answer whether they did enough to prevent harm. Did checks fail? Were warnings ignored? Were there systems that could have intercepted a pattern and did nothing? If the answer is yes, then the reforms that follow will matter more than any headline. The industry could tighten vetting. Contracts could include more robust disclosure clauses. Management teams could institute clearer boundaries between personal relationships and professional endorsements. Those changes are not glamorous. They are slow, but they are the kind of structural shifts that prevent repeats. As the calendar ticks on, the public's attention will move in waves. New stories will emerge. Old scandals will resurface. That's how the media ecosystem operates. But for those who want clarity, the best guide is patience. Legal processes take time. Evidence needs to be verified. Claims require corroboration. The appetite for immediate judgment must be tempered with the reality of methodical inquiry. Still, the emotional residue of this moment will linger. Trust, once broken, doesn't mend overnight. Careers can recover, brands can rebuild, but the memory of a scandal stays lodged in narrative memory. It's the piece that surfaces whenever a similar occurrence happens again. That's the cost of association in a world where reputation is a currency. So where do things stand now? The case that started with missed rent and a whisper has become a study in how quickly networks and reputations can be endangered by proximity. It's a reminder that in industries built on relationships, the risks of misplaced trust are not hypothetical. They are real, measurable, and sometimes devastating. What we watch next will tell us more than any early headline. Will there be a full accounting? Will the legal documents show isolated misconduct or systemic failure? Will the people involved step forward with more answers, or will the silence continue to shape the narrative? Those are the threads to follow. One thing is certain, this isn't a story that wraps up neatly. It will play out in filings, in interviews, and in the slow churn of legal discovery. And as long as it does, people will keep asking what responsibility looks like in a world where personal relationships overlap with public brands. If you're wondering what to look for next, watch the documents. Watch for subpoenas and for civil suits. Watch for internal memos that leak. Watch for the tone of official statements, measured, evasive, or contrite, and notice who speaks and who stays silent. Those are the signals that usually tell you whether a scandal is bending toward resolution or escalation. And remember the other story underneath all of this, the human cost. The people who lost money, the people whose lives were quietly rearranged by promises that turned out to be false. Their voices are the measure of harm here, and their restitution should be the real endpoint of any accountability. This is a cautionary tale about the price of proximity. It's about how names can be leveraged, how trust can be weaponized, and how reputations can be reshaped by someone else's choices. It's also a story about systems, the checks we don't always see until they fail, and about the slow work of rebuilding once they do. And if you think this is the end, hold on. The next chapter is always the one people don't expect. More records, more calls, more reckonings. The quiet parts of investigations are often the loudest when they surface. Stay with it. Watch the filings. Watch the statements. Keep your skepticism calibrated and your focus on the people who actually suffered losses. Because in the end, that's the clearest way to measure what truly happened. And don't go anywhere. Click the next video you see on your screen for even more juicy celebrity chaos, betrayals, and stories Hollywood doesn't want you to know. See you in the next one.